Stuart Clark, Deputy Editor of Hot Press. Hello, how are you?
I'm good, just about surviving. It's been a busy start to the new year.
Yeah, and a busy end to 2021 based on this wonderful publication that we're going to talk about.
Oh, yes.
Thank you to Mark Hogan for sending me on a copy. Good man, Mark. I haven't properly leafed through it, but it's the story of Dolores O'Riordan and the Cranberries, kind of as told through the pages of Hot Press over the years.
Absolutely, and even before that, through the pages of the Limerick Tribune. For once in my life, I was in the right place at the right time as a local radio DJ and a hack in Limerick in 1989, when four very hairy blokes started the Cranberry Saurus. They were nearly called the Cranberry Doodles, so it could have been worse. And then the hairiest guy left.
Well, the Cranberry Sauce was pretty hairy, actually, as a pun to begin with. Did you ever get to the roots of who thought those puns would be in some way amusing?
I think it was Chief Punner Niall Quinn, the lead singer, who left to return to his day job with the Hitchers, leaving a vacancy. And I thought, like, the original Cranberry Saurus made quite a nice sort of Smithsonian jangle. They're of their time, but were decent. So I thought they had a chance of making waves.
Well, Stuart, let me ask you, because I remember that time. I went to college in UCC in 1991, and I would love to say I was there. I have often said I was, but I wasn't. But people would say the old college bar in UCC was a tiny little spot. Great crack of a spot where you'd go up for your mugs of very stiff. The spoon would barely turn in the cup. The coffee was so stiff. But the Cranberries played there, and seemingly, very early days. And Dolores was so petrified of live performing in front of people that she performed with her back to the audience. So I wasn't there, but I often say, "Oh yeah, I was there."
That's exactly what happened. I thought they'd pre-break up when a lead singer of a new band leaves. It's normally curtains. My girlfriend at the time was going to Laurel Hill, the posh school in Limerick, and said, one of the girls in my year is going to try out for these lads, you know. I said, well, who is she? She went, Dolores. I said, is she any good? Well, she sings a really nice Ave Maria in the choir, but I don't think she's ever been to a rock gig. So when I heard this, and even the lads weren't too sure, she turned up for the audition in a pink tracksuit with a Casio keyboard under her arm, plugged it in and going plink, 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 and they were going like, Jesus, what on earth? In fact, some of the language they used to describe her when she arrived is quite colourful in the book. And then, of course, she went and sang Nothing Compares to You, and their jaws just kind of hit the ground. But yeah, the first time I saw them live, I think it was their first gig with Dolores, was downstairs in Cruise's Hotel, which is now a shopping precinct, supporting They Do It with Mirrors, who'd got themselves an EP deal with Satanta Records in London, which amounted to the big time. If you're a Limerick band, you could go no further really than that, an EP out in the UK. And she looks at the drummer, her feet, the ceiling, the PA, anything but the crowd. And her voice went in and out of tune. But you could kind of tell there was sort of something there. But it was a few more months before we knew exactly what.
And there were so many kind of bands at that time, after all of what had gone on in the 80s, and after, obviously, you barely need to mention, but the U2 going stratospheric and all that, who will be the next and all of that malarkey. But there were so many great bands. I was friends with the Emperors of Ice Cream Boys in Cork at the time, and they were amongst the Cork bands. The Sultans, obviously, and the Frank and Walters had done their thing, had been on top of the pop. There was a real indie buzz, no question about it. And I was an indie kid in 91 until Cork and Sir Henry's got its so I spent the rest of the 90s in beats and hip hop and
raving away
yeah,
like the rest
absolutely,
of us.
Yeah.
I mean, Sir Henry's was such a wonderful place that people in Limerick aspired. I mean, again, that was the big time, going down to Cork to play in Sir Henry's. But a couple of gigs actually I know were very big for the Cranberries. Cork Rocks,
yes,
put them on the A&R radar. And not long after, a plane load of A&R people flew over from Heathrow. By chance, I was on that plane, and it was a real record industry jolly to see them play in the Jetland in Limerick. And then they played in Sir Henry's, and actually Kevin Barry, who's a Limerick head but also has great Cork connections,
was friend of mine from that time.
Exactly, he was on a rival newspaper to me, the Limerick Post, whilst writing his novel. There's about like 6 manuscripts under his bed, none of them completed. But Kevin was there raving away, and Shane Fitzsimons, another local head down your way, said, let's see if we can blag in next door and see this band from your neck of the woods. And Kev went in there and said, like, everyone was just going like, oh my God. What happened was they did those kind of couple of gigs where they were really all over the place. And Noel to this day is really embarrassed about them. But there was a guy called Piers Gilmore, who had a better ear than me, who ran Xeric Studios in Limerick. and they'd just done their leaving certs and had nothing planned for the summer. So he said, look, I'll put you on a pocket money wage, 20 quid a week. Why don't you come into Zurich and we'll kind of rehearse and write in the morning and I'll record you in the afternoon. And of course, back then recording was a luxury. There were no home computers. It was at least 1,500 quid to go and do a demo. So the offer of free, recording time was massive. So at the end of the summer, we got a little note from Pierce saying, look, come up, there's a bottle of Jack Daniels with your name on it, for a little showcase gig. I want you to see the Cranberry sauce and see what you make of them. So I went up there. Dolores had kind of rock and rollified. She looked really sharp. Came out, Compositato, boom, into Linger, which was the first song she ever wrote. I mean, it's just extraordinary.
It is, because that's a very special song. It really is. It's kind of shivers up the spine. And, you talked about her, their jaws dropping when she sang, and like, what a voice. There was something really special. Like, that's what I was kind of trying to, as you'll know. And by the way, I'd like to get a little bit of your story, as in, and you in that time and where you were and what you were doing. I mean, you are a Limerick man. That's your kind of, that's where.
Yeah, I mean, I'm, as you can probably tell, not from the banks of the Shannon, but I've been in Ireland for a long, long time. I've been involved in pirate radio in the UK, things like Radio Caroline, which was off the UK on a boat. But I got a bit like, I just, living on a ship for 9 or 10 weeks at a time. And anyway, look, there was a great pirate rush before they closed down the stations, and I pitched up in Limerick and the stations were closed down, and then I got to start writing. And, I was doing the Limerick Tribune, where I was given 2 or 3 pages just to write about music. It was a real luxury.
So are you like an Irish Englishman, or are you just an Englishman that's ended over in Ireland?
No granny from Cavan, Anglo-Saxon, through and through. Don't know how it happens. No connections. The expectations of me, age 15, 16, 17, ending up anywhere in Ireland were zero.
Right.
But it was the pirate radio. I was obsessed with it. And
was that not like, I mean, it was in probably UK waters, but did it go off O'Meath or something up in?
Well, I tell you what, there's an interesting connection. The original Radio Caroline started in 1964. It was fitted out near Carlingford,
yes,
in the port there.
Yes.
And the owner was Ronan O'Reilly,
yes. The son of
the O'Reilly. So
O'Reilly, yeah.
A rebel spirit. His father owned the port of Grenor, so he started up the station.
Yes, Grenor, sorry, because I'm from that part of the world.
Yeah,
I lived out the Cooley Peninsula.
I've paid pilgrimages to Grenor, which is it's like stepping back in time to 1920s England, because it was built by English people. It's almost like a film set.
Red brick terraced houses, a little village kind of created built for the workers of the dock, I presume.
It's like Coronation Street in County Louth.
My grandparents used to bring me there on the Sunday spins. There's a little totem pole over in the field, and it was built and kitted out there.
It was kitted out there, and then it sort of was on the air on and off till the late 70s, and then it sunk, literally sunk. So they got a new boat which they fitted out, and it came back. And I was on the second boat in about 1988. I was the hippie newsreader. There are photographs to prove it. But I'd been into pirate radio since I was a kid. The word legal does not mean right, and some of the best radio.
Where are you from in the UK? Are you from in England?
I'm from Kent, sort of about 25 miles south of London. Which was great, because punk rock hit at just the right time. I was 14 or 15. I was able to mitch off school and go and see the Clash in the Lyceum. So it was. But
wow.
I'd done a pirate ship called the Voice of Peace, which had been bankrolled in the early 70s by John Lennon, amongst others, which was off the coast of Israel. So you're basically told by Caroline, if you went and did the Voice of Peace and you were grievously ill and could handle life on the boat, they'd have
You're
you.
in.
So I went out and did 6 months.
Stuart, when's the book? When's the Stuart Clark book coming out?
I don't know. But, the offshore radio thing was a boy's own adventure. Being on this 1,000-ton trawler, 14 miles off the coast of Essex.
The boat that rocked loosely.
Yeah, we didn't have the groupies and that kind of bad behaviour, but the boat looked right. But to go back to your original point, there was also a Radio Caroline North that about 1964 set up shop off the coast of the Isle of Man. They used to bomb into Dublin, so they had a Dublin office. And also there's a guy called Philip Solomon got involved with Radio Caroline, who was an impresario, I think from Belfast. And of course, they had Paola on Radio Caroline. And one of the records that was plugged on Radio Caroline and became the bizarrest hit, and they made it onto Top of the Pops in 1967, was the Dubliners' 7 Drunken Nights, So all these weird Irish records that Philip Solomon had signed were played on Radio Caroline and The Bachelors and people like that. So it's a really interesting sort of like side story to the Irish music industry.
So this sort of brings you into Ireland. So when do you kind of jump off ship and stay ashore?
Well, this is not long before the Cranberries, and I'd been on pirate radio, that was closed down, and I landed the rock show gig on Radio Limerick 1, the legal radio station.
And this is what brings you to Limerick, and your pals with Shane Fitzsimons ran like scores of gigs in Cork over the years. Kevin Barry ended up living in Cork too. He loved the Cork buzz. As I say, I was buddies with it. He's a very talented author right now. Second City trilogy amongst the books. He's a literary giant in the making, if not already.
Like, I'm not trying to make out it was like Warhol circa 1969. But in Limerick, there are these really creative people, like Kevin Barry is one of them. Aoife Nakana, who's a fine DJ, one of the first kind of real sort of house DJs in this country. She was there, and a load of people who, and because there was no sort of like, there's no venue in Limerick, there's people being really inventive and renting back rooms and top floors and doing stuff. There was a real DIY mentality, and it was very exciting. But we had this thing, the great U2 kind of thing, that a band called Tuesday Blue had been signed by EMI Manhattan, and the first album came out, and we thought we had our own U2. Then they got dropped. So if Limerick had an inferiority complex, we can't achieve greatness before that. It was just like, oh my God, this is the best thing that's come out of Limerick. They got a major deal.
Yeah.
Everyone's, the Guns N' Roses producer has produced the second album, never got released, and they failed. So the chances now are zero. In fact, before the Cranberries, the last person from Limerick to have appeared on Top of the Pops was Terry Wogan doing the floral dance.
What about Toasted Heretic, Julian Gough? Do they have a Limerick thing at all?
No, they may.
Or are they more? No, he's maybe more Galway, is he?
Galway. They could have kept it hidden. And you know what? I really do. When I say to people I'm going home, I could mean going to Limerick, going to Dublin, or going to Kent to see my mum. I bought into Limerick. It's a tough city. It's a port city. At first, I was a bit like, oh my God, it is, but once people let you in, they're your friends for life. And I really got annoyed with Stab City, this whole rhetoric. So we also had a paper called Night Times, and one of the headlines, the Cranberries were part of it, was like, Music City, not Stab City. And I just think Limerick craved a band that would, just break out of the city. And you can see it now. Obviously, Denise Chyler and the guys are doing their own thing. But there is the spirit of the Cranberries. Denise was impressed with Dolores growing up. And the fact that the Cranberries became one of the biggest bands in the world has allowed Limerick artists to have that expectation. And I think it's still a real influence on that hip hop and rock scene in Limerick.
Okay, so we've got a little bit of a sense of where you are at in all of that. So you've had the band, the Limerick band that got signed. You think these are the band that are going to spearhead. They get dropped. There's a bit of disappointment around, and you've told that story of coming into that. Well, what was it? An open gig that yourself, Shane, and Kevin were said come in and see these guys, the Cranberries saw. So bring us to that. So you see these guys and think, well, actually, maybe these are the Limerick band that are gonna.
Well, when I saw those 6 or 7 songs, I was absolutely convinced. And what happened then was they'd do a demo every 2 or 3 months, and it wasn't just slightly better each time; it was a quantum leap. And the 6 songs became 10 songs, and then, as I say, Cork Rocks happened. Word got to the UK. Suddenly they're signing to Ireland, one of the biggest record companies in the world, and it looked like that was it, happy days. But that, in a way, was a little bit of a false start.
And do they deserve equal credit as a 4-piece for the driving forward of that, or was there one of the band that really sort of paved the way for the others? Sometimes you have in a band the songwriter, and well, I know Dolores was the lyricist.
Yeah.
Was there a musical driving force amongst them?
Well, the chemistry between Dolores and Noel is just that sort of alchemy. You can't quite define it. And Dolores obviously did a lot of the music. Noel did. They'd knock the songs around. And you might sometimes think, well, Fergal played the drums and Mike played the bass, but they were the only drummer and bassist that worked with the Cranberries. Stephen Street's interviewed in the book, and he says Blur wouldn't have happened if there were 4 Damon Albans.
Mm.
It just wouldn't happen. It is the chemistry.
Mm.
And like Fergal brought something, Mike brought a sense of humor. Apparently he was the guy in the studio that used to sort of, focus people's thoughts and also have the laugh when things were getting a bit tense. So it really was the component parts. And I just don't think it would have happened the same way with different personnel.
Mm. Yeah, and I mean, people underestimate how hard it must be to form a band and keep a band together, because it must be tricky. Life on the road ain't no picnic. But anyway, let's not get too far ahead of ourselves, because we're sort of establishing the roots of the band. And so you sort of indicated that they had a kind of a quite a quick acceleration, and that they as a band improved dramatically very quickly. But then it had a bit of a misstep or a lull, or a...
What happened was, things back then were driven, for good or bad, by the Melody Makers sounds and the NME, the British Inkies that came out every Thursday and Friday. And they, along with John Peel, were kind of like the gatekeepers to fame and fortune. And what happened was, because they'd released all these songs on demo, when the album came out, all the journalists are going, well, we've heard these songs. And it was kind of like a bit of a backlash, which I think was totally unfair. So actually, they were going around in ever decreasing circles. There was a nadir when they played the Psychic Pig in Trowbridge, which apparently was even worse than it sounds. And they thought they were going to be dropped. They weren't selling records. It was a year in, and they got a Hothouse Flowers tour in Europe, which they thought was going to be their last hurrah.
So everybody else is doing it. Why can't we? Wasn't quite an immediate success.
No, Stephen Street talks about the fact that fingers were pointed at him for not delivering a successful album. Now it seems incredible, but at the time he said there was a lot of finger pointing. And Noel tells the story that they went over to do this Hothouse Flowers tour in Europe. They had no money. The advance had run out. They were relying on Liam and Wanley and the boys for beer and food. And, it was a last paid holiday, or unpaid holiday. And they got a phone call from Island Records in New York saying, lads, 2 or 3 of the big college radio stations, which are how you generate a buzz in America as an indie band, are into you. MTV wants a video, which you haven't got. Drop everything and get across to America. So I don't think the lads had ever left Europe before, any of them. They're suddenly in LA with Melody McDaniel as director in a flop house doing the Linger video, this film noir video. And Melody says, oh, a mate of mine's going to pop in, I hope you don't mind, called Michael. And I went, lovely, look forward to meeting Michael. Michael Stipe. So it was just kind of like 1 minute they were going down the toilet, boom, and the next they were hanging.
Michael Stipe of REM, for anyone who's not of our vintage to remember that.
Yeah.
The biggest band on the planet probably at the time, or they were up there with U2 anyway.
Oh, that was the height of their commercial powers. And we spoke to Michael, actually. Lovely man.
Yeah, he's featured in, now we haven't mentioned the book, but I'm sure we've put it in the title to this piece. Why Can't We? Story of the Cranberries and the band's iconic frontwoman Dolores O'Riordan, curated by you, Stuart Clark, as told through the pages of Hot Press. And Kevin Barry, the aforementioned there, he is.
Yeah, Kevin
and there's
contributes a lovely piece. Yeah.
But just on, and we'll come back to the book too, maybe to finish, we'll kind of flick through what are the little bits in it. Because in a way, we're trying to encourage people to, particularly those who are fans of the Cranberries and Dolores O'Riordan, there is a great testament to the band through the Irish rock magazine Hot Press, with us since 1978, as I saw on Reeling in the Ears, Niall Stokes and his cool crinkly hair.
Absolutely.
Looking great. But because bands, obviously, there's so many bands of bigger stature than the Cranberries were at what seemed to have been a bit of a low point for the band, as you describe it there, tried to crack the States and would work their little asses off trying to do so. So in a way, rather unusually, the States came calling.
Yeah, and there was a little bit of snobbery, I think, then amongst English journalists and Irish journalists that they'd been bypassed. Right? That's why I think it's only maybe slightly in retrospect, since the tragic loss of Dolores, that we've quite evaluated how big they were and what sort of effect they've had on popular culture.
Well, I want to chip in, and correct me but there's potentially an element of how music changed from early 90s on into late 90s and early 90s in terms of the dance thing. And equally, like in the UK, then there was the Britpop thing, which they weren't really a part of. And then, of course, obviously Nirvana were around in the early 90s. The grunge thing was there, which the Cranberries weren't a part of. Maybe they fed in some aspects of it, or they certainly had their heavier moments. like on Zombie, but so I sort of, as big as they were in America, maybe just the UK, Ireland, and Europe were in slightly different place to fully appreciate what the Cranberries were at the time. Is there any merit in any of that?
I think the UK, and by extension, I think what's happened over the last 20 or 30 years, we've stopped looking to London and Ireland and LA for validation. But there was still a little bit about the NME says this is great. The NME said, I'm not sure you'd have had too many successful festivals, in Ireland with just Irish acts. It was almost like, oh, it's only Irish acts. Now, of course, it's like Irish acts because we don't have any inferiority complex. But back then, there was a little bit of looking to London for validation, which they didn't do in France and Italy and Spain. So they are, if you talk to an Italian, U2 and the Cranberries are interchangeable in terms of how big they are.
Yes.
And in France, even towards the end, they weren't playing to 2,000, they're playing to 10,000, 20,000 people. They were, and I literally coming to the studio just now, I tripped physically over a pallet of books that are being sent to Mexico. They were massive in South America, Central America.
So who do you think underestimated them, the UK or Ireland or both?
I think the UK were a bit ticked off that they weren't consulted almost. It was that sort of thing.
Or that it wasn't the success in the UK that made them. They made it somewhere else without needing the UK, maybe.
Yeah, exactly. Because I do think the NME and Sounds of Mellymaker, they wielded a lot of power. And that's quite intoxicating. When some band did it without their permission, I think it really ticked them off.
Well, yeah, you can kind of see where that would come from. I mean, all of those worlds and the music, everything, there's egos in all of it, isn't there?
Yes, one or two.
So they shoot a video for Linger in the States. Michael Stipe's a fan. What does that do for them then? What happens?
Well, Michael Stipe being a fan led to REM taking them out on tour as soon as they could do, because he said he just thought he met loads of bands and he said they were just so different, so fresh, maybe a little naive in inverted commas, but he said just so up for it, the kids in the sweet shop. And he loved that first album, wanted to see them on stage every night. So that's why he took them out. There was no buying onto the tour. But yeah, Linger got played to death on MTV. And especially then, if you're on MTV every 2 hours, you're in the top 10 in America.
I kind of had forgotten, and I started to sort of remember as you described it that way, that it did strike me that the album had been out a while before it became a sensation. And being into music, as I am and I was, and into Irish bands, because you wanted to see Irish bands succeed. I mean, they were the bands I looked to as a youngster, you wanted to support your own and see them and follow with them, be like, I was a fan from the beginning kind of thing. So, we knew the Cranberry songs. We liked the Cranberry songs. They were a band from Limerick. When you're in Cork, that's like, it's cousins, it's sister state, it's sister city, or...
It's not Dublin. It's the rest of the country against Dublin to an extent now, but especially then, there was this feeling the Dublin media looked down on the rest of the country. And I noticed that very strongly being in Limerick. The fact there'd be a news bulletin saying O'Connell Street, you say, well, we've got an O'Connell Street. Which O'Connell Street? It was just this assumption that everything was happening in Dublin.
Although I did flick through the thing, right? And what I landed on was, I think it might have been a Joe Jackson interview with them. And he talks about how Irish bands might be quite different and stuff, but they still support each other. You two boys own the Corrs. And Dolores goes, oh, well, they're all Dublin. And he goes, oh, well, the Corrs are Dundalk. You're all the same up there. And I'm kind of going, no, we're not.
There's a bit of reverse snobbery.
Dundalk, Dublin is not the same.
She did not like the Corrs. There's several passages in this book. A lot of people think they were quite similar, but she didn't like their Irishness.
Well, I, again, grew up in Dundalk, and there's a pub called McManus's that I think their uncle owned, and they used to serve in the pub. Like, I've been served pints. Well, Sharon was in my sister's class in school and was a very beautiful girl. And like my sister's school annual magazine, like the odd time I'd kind of get it, and I'd have a flick through to look for Sharon Corr, because she was, very Spanish looking and very, she was like, she stood out from everybody. You were like, she's gorgeous. But they worked at McManus's pub and they'd serve pints in there. And again, for me growing up, a band meant you're in a dingy dive, you're making demos, you're sweaty. And we'd heard that the Corrs were in a band, but unless you're out doing this giggy stuff and trying to make EPs, you're not a real band. And the next thing, and we knew she'd been in the Commitments. Andrea Corr had a little bit part in the Commitments. That's right. One of my favorite memories, actually, of this room here, we do our annual sort of round table. And many moons ago, we had 8 or 9 people in December, and it was Sharon and Joe Elliott from Def Leppard, and they became best buddies. You think there's nothing in common, but of course they have music in common, and off they went. I think they went to the pub around the corner, but Sharon and Joe really hit it off. That was a nice kind of musical union. And Dundalk's a small place, so we knew them all. Like I was friends with her boyfriend as a teenager, Philip Marks, and there was a bunch of us all in the jacuzzi in the Fairways Hotel. So one of my stories when the chorus got big was I was in a jacuzzi with her, admittedly with 12 others, one of them being her boyfriend, but still. But when they became huge, it was a bit of a surprise too, but you can absolutely see why. I mean, they were obviously talented. They looked great. I mean, walking into an A&R sort of office and like, so you can all play music, you can write songs, and you look like that. Let's go.
With Jim's raw charisma and sex appeal, they're always going to be massive.
But I can also see why a rocky band like the Cranberries might not. Yeah, it is. We all have our chips in our shoulders, maybe, or our what would you call them? Things to sort of maybe get over. And back then everything was a lot more divided back then in terms of genre and in terms of what you were into and what you weren't into.
Oh, music back then, you see, was the only game in town, and it was very tribal. Yes. Kevin Barry makes that point. It's not as tribal anymore.
No.
You liked your bands, you stood by them, you hated the opposition. Like I remember when I was going through my regrettable heavy metal phase as a Motorhead fan. I don't regret Motorhead, but I hated Two Tone, and now I'm going to go to the Specials, and I hated. But you had your entrenched position. But obviously, people in Limerick were kind of going, it's number 110, it's number 93, it's number 32, it's in the top 20. And there's a famous 1993 homecoming show, and it's a bit like Nirvana in Sir Henry's. About 80,000 Limerick people claimed to be in the Theatre Royal that night. There was only about 800, and that was like Cranberries mania, and they came back the conquering heroes, and it's singularly one of the best gigs I've ever been to. I can remember just the sheer adrenaline buzz and the sense of joy as people, and it was a celebration of not just the Cranberries, but of being from Limerick. We've done it, happy days. It was quite amazing.
So, okay, so America kind of latches on, Michael Stipe support, brings them on tour, blows them up. MTV roll the Linger video out ad nauseum, and retrospectively then the album takes off in the UK and in Ireland, across Europe, and the Cranberries are a massive band. And are they ready for it at that time? Because what I noted when I had a look back just at the discography was that, I suppose, well, they call, maybe you be able to enlighten me, but everybody else is doing it, so why can't we? Which was obviously their way of sort of motivating themselves to release their records or to make them in the first place. Well, why? And that was kind of you talked about insecurities, or maybe lack of belief that people in Ireland and Irish people might have had about themselves, and looking for the outside validation. I mean, even the name of that, the title of the album is almost them kind of going, well, fuck it, why don't we? Let's just do it. And so good on them for that spirit. But it was 91 to 93. So did it come out in 91? And was it 93 it took off? Because the next album was 94, which is a very quick turnaround.
It's going 92, 93. I mean, obviously they've been writing songs in sound check and on the tour bus. I mean, what was very fortunate was it was a double whammy. They had Linger, but then you need a second single. And luckily, as the second single, they had Dreams, which, as we know, is a global phenomenon still. It's rolled out in all sorts of like weird and wonderful places, not least at Crow Park when Limerick turn up to win every year the All Ireland. But they had a confidence. Dolores always made everything seem so easy, which it's not. And she wasn't without nerves, but for some reason, when she hit the stage, once she initially got into the groove, it was incredible. So when they started playing live, they did that famous tour with Suede, where Suede were the headliners. And by the end, the Cranberries had to go on last because the whole crowd were leaving. And Brett Anderson didn't find that very amusing. So that was a kind of a turnover point. They started off playing in dive bars in America, so they paid their dues. And then, of course, they won important friends like Simon Le Bon, who'd been plastered on Dolores' wall 3 years earlier, suddenly was standing in front of her when they went out and supported Duran Duran. And he said they're a bit concerned because you want the support act to be good, but not too good. They said the reaction for the Cranberries was getting more and more sort of like over the top.
And that feels a funny mix, the Cranberries and Duran, being honest with you. But maybe that's just because the more rocky times. Just as you were talking about the songs, though, I'm hearing the melodies, and her amazing voice, her great delivery, their unique look. There was a driving beat, but they had melodies. They had really, really good melodies.
And the thing is, Dolores' voice was so distinctive. You never have to Shazam her. You just know it's her. And that, again, is quite rare in music, where people sound a bit sort of samey. But yeah, it didn't take long. I mean, I think also because the height of the fame is in the States, that we forget that she sang to not one but two popes. She guest presented Saturday Night Live with George Clooney. She's on the cover of the Rolling Stones. They supported the Rolling Stones, one of those gigs in the San Siro. Apparently, Dolores had no idea what the San Siro was, not being a football fan. I was like, oh, this is rather big. And there's a great story about that because apparently Ronnie Wood, before, I suppose, Me Too, wolf whistled her as she walked down in her hot pants. And Dolores just went up and waggled her finger and said, you stop that, you dirty old man. I mean, the confidence to go up to the band that are facilitating you being there. And now it was with a glint in the eye.
Yeah, yeah.
And there's a couple of things that you might necessarily get from Dolores through the music. One of those is she was the crack. She was so wickedly funny. And she had a gang of older brothers. So she could tell errant male band members off, and she could tell errant male journalists off in a very charming way. But she would tell you, like, shut it, I'm not going there. And you'd respect that. She was naive in terms of the fact she didn't know much about rock and roll, but she was a very smart girl and she learned really quickly. And one thing she learned very early on, very important is how to say no.
Well, I mean, you don't pull the wool over Limerick people's eyes very easily. No, they're ready and waiting for you.
No, she was a bright kid. And
she had a bit of that magic. There are some amazing stories. How, in terms of what you're telling me and how we're hearing this, how is that laid out through the book?
Well, what we do is we do it chronologically. So there's a lot of archive material, and we do it because gorgeous photo. The camera loved her. Because I think if you see it in real time, you realize just how quickly it blew up. Also, the backbone are 10 or 11 very, very long interviews with Dolores. And if they tried to media train her, it didn't work because Dolores spoke her mind and she didn't care about being seen as hip and trendy. There's always been a knee-jerk liberal thing in music, unless you're Ted Nugent. But Dolores had her faith. She was a Catholic, didn't take it all on board. She'd pick a mix, but she had certain beliefs that she expressed, and I admired her for that. But also what you see is that arc that we see with so many artists. And I think in a way more often with female artists, because they still think it's a very sexist industry and it's harder to be a woman in the industry. So you see the kid in the sweet shop, I'm meeting Michael Stipe, I'm hanging out with Simon Le Bon, I'm doing all those things. Then it's kind of like, great, we're even bigger. And then somebody hands you a piece of paper telling you what you're doing every day for the next year and a half. You're getting out of bed at 7 o'clock in the morning to do Japanese press. You're then going off to do an interview. You're having your hair and makeup done twice. The boys can be in the bar getting piddled because no one wants to talk to them, really. You're the face of the Cranberries and you're doing 12-hour days.
I was just going to say that she did carry a lot on her shoulders, really, didn't she?
The boys said that they could go for a drink, around the corner from the venue before and after, and nobody would bother them if they had baseball caps on. Dolores got to the point she was as big as Madonna, and she couldn't leave the hotel room. And she was a home bird. I mean, a big family. She loved her family. It's very, very telling talking of family. I asked her once, what's your greatest achievement? I thought it could have been umpteen answers. Being a mum. That's what she said. And she meant it. Being a mum, that was the biggest thing she ever did, was have those gorgeous kids.
I mean, look at that photo of her over there.
Oh, I wonder if I can find the one, mate. Actually,
that's real. Like, look how young she is and how rocky that looks and how raw. And that was how the early 90s was. I mean, you talk about Sir Henry's, these venues were raw, rough places. And there's some of the Catholic imagery, I guess, there on that. That's quite a dramatic thing.
That's right. I'm trying to find the one now.
And there's the wedding. I remember the wedding at the time. There's her marrying big Don Burton in 94.
It's very funny, her talking about her dad saying, yeah, that's lovely, but where's the dress? He thought he'd be brought in to see the knickers. But again, that was Dolores for you. I'm just trying to find my favorite photo of the whole book. Where is it? I'll try and find it.
Take your time. If there's anyone who's carried on with us through this long, then they're in, I'm sure.
You see that?
Yeah, class. What page? Oh yeah, that's class. It's like she's doing an Irish dance or something.
You know what it was? It was the third gig in. They were in some dive bar in Florida. It looks like someone's throwing a bucket of water over. There was so much sweat in the venue. And she's got the crop now. She's got the cut-off hot pants, a pair of Doc Martens, a Metallica sweatshirt, and she's Irish dancing. And that is Dolores for you. She just did not give a flying.
Now, you obviously saw them loads of times. They rocked live, presumably.
They're great live. I didn't see them tons of times because, you know, I was chained to my desk. So, you know, we're talking about 7 or 8 rather than 20 or 30, which it might have been if they'd have come back and done, you know, the gigs were fairly sort of rare here. But they became a very slick outfit, which with it was a plus and a minus. It's interesting because I think, you know, it is fair to say some of the mid-career albums were not as great as they could have been. And there's a couple of reasons for those. One, you were on this ridiculous, you know, treadmill of recording, promo, album, tour, and they weren't getting much time to work on records. You know, as they say, it's a cliche, you have your whole life to work on your debut album. Album number 3, you've got 3 months suddenly when you're knackered. And they probably did a few too many world tours. They say that they should have actually been a bit more demonstrative and said, we're not doing this because we need time. So, you know, you sell 9 million records, the record company wants the next one to sell 20 million records. If you sell 20 million, where do you go there? You've got to go to 40 million. And there's a lot of pressure. But also, Dolores wasn't Bob Dylan. She never professed to be. Her genius, I think, was taking pretty complex human emotions and expressing them in quite a simple way. I'm just a fool for you. We've all been a fool for somebody. We've all made idiots of ourselves in the name of love. And Simon Le Bon says that is just one of those genius lines. You couldn't sit down by committee and write it. It has to come from somewhere. And it came from that first heartbreak she experienced before she joined the band. And when you stop being able to live normally and to maybe love normally, and you're watching, she described it herself as her CNN album. She sat there going, oh my God, Bosnia, Sarajevo, this is awful, which it was. I'm going to write about it. But she's writing about something secondhand through the TV. She wasn't writing about her heart, her heartbreak, her hopes, her family. And when she was writing about stuff she knew, that's when I think she was a genius.
Yeah. They, no doubt, like any band, went through troubles and travails. You mentioned they feel they did too many world tours and wore themselves out a little bit. So, you know, where was their peak? Is it that early to mid 90s to late 90s?
I was really pleased in the same way that I think Bowie's legacy would have been different without Black Star, and the same way that Johnny Cash's legacy would have been different without the American recordings. Tragically, it had to be finished posthumously. You know, Dolores had passed away. That last album was her content in the first flush of her romance with her boyfriend, Ollie Koretsky, who I spoke to for the book. Still grieving. I mean, the guy is in tatters. What a lovely man, though. He spoke rather beautifully about how they fell in love and their life together, which normality crept back in. You know, she was spending her time between Limerick, coming across here, and Ollie loved her family, and the family loved him, and then living in Manhattan, which is no great respecter of celebrity. And talking of David Bowie, he made the point that he could hide in plain sight in Manhattan. You know, he'd walk down the road and someone go, you don't like David Bowie? You go, yeah, how are you, whatever. Or they go Bowie, but that was it. You know, New Yorkers are pretty cool. She was able to go to 7-Eleven and get her groceries again. She was able to go and get a pizza. She was able to walk around the block with the kids. So she was having a normal life. And the songs, albeit, you know, from a woman who was around 50, are more similar to the debut album than any of the songs in the middle of their career. And it got a Grammy nod. Some people thought it's just, oh, Dolores has died, but they give her a Grammy nod. Yeah. But I think it deserved it. I think it's a really good record. I would say to some people who maybe sort of gave up on the Cranberries mid-career for whatever reason, and sometimes longevity it inspires, like, sort of, oh, you know, I see this in the UK. Oh, you've been around for 2 albums, you can't be any good anymore. You know, we have a culture now that wants stuff to change all the time, the hip new band. So a lot of people took the Cranberries for granted, or maybe didn't like the middle albums. Go and listen to this last album in the end. It's the spirit of the first record, but of people being their age. And it's got a lot of layers. I think it's a great record.
Good. Okay. Well, I think this looks like a remarkable publication. So for anyone who's not thrown their ears around the last Cranberries album, there's Stuart Clark's push to do so. And this is a great tribute to the band and to the late, great Dolores O'Riordan. I'm really pleased to see, as I flick through, that Kelly Lewis is in there. Kelly is from, hang on a second, let me see, can I get, there she is, there's Kelly Lewis. She kind of trades off both Cork and Limerick. I think she's probably Limerick, but she's from a village called Skehenarinka. It used to be on the main Cork to Dublin road.
Oh,
it means the dancing hawthorn bush. Either someone was drinking too much of the poachine and the bush started dancing, or maybe the dancing happened at the hawthorn bush there. But she was in college in Cork when she was on The Voice of Ireland. I used to have her, obviously doing a drive show in Cork. You're going to trade on anything that's happening for Cork people. So I had Kelly on regularly, and she was so excited about having Dolores O'Riordan as a mentor, and spoke so warmly of her. And I think that was a lovely time for Irish people to get to know Dolores in a different way too, and see her just as just a really nice woman.
Kelly had grown up in awe of the Cranberries and Dolores in particular. It was Dolores that made her think that she could do it. And we spoke to her, and it's really telling that obviously Dolores was contracted to do The Voice of Ireland for a season or 2 seasons, and she picked Kelly. And apparently she was lovely and was buying her gifts and all sorts of things, and introduced her to her kids. But, Kelly thought, you're a superstar, you're going back to Toronto, back to your life. I'm never going to see you again. But Dolores kept in contact and mentored her. No managerial thing, just for pure decency. And they kept in contact. And Dolores sort of listened to the songs and actually wanted to bring Kelly over to her studio in Toronto to work with a producer she had lined up, purely as a pal. And Kelly said she used to sort of text and whatever and get a text back. She texted her about a week before Dolores passed away, just to see where the arrangements might have been. I think they had to postpone the recording once before because Dolores hadn't been well, and we know she had some severe, sort of mental health difficulties and things towards the end. But sadly, the return email didn't sort of come back. But it's a measure of Dolores that, she went way beyond her mentoring duties and really took this talented youngster under her arm.
If it's distasteful, we don't need to talk about it. But how, for those who don't recall, what happened to Dolores? Why did she die? And it was a young age to die at.
It was an accidental, the verdict was an accidental drowning. She was in her bath in a London hotel. Prior to that, it's interesting, she had spoken to me in interviews about stuff that had happened to her. She said, this dark stuff, I don't want to go there. And you probably know this as an interviewer yourself. Obviously, you're there to draw stuff out of people. You're also a human being. And I didn't feel comfortable saying, well, what is that? And prodding. And I don't think she would have gone there, but I wasn't going to go there either. But often with things like that there's a point in your career and your life that it's something you want to talk about. And Barry Egan of the Sunday Independent was a very good friend of hers too, and a confidant. And Dolores on one occasion phoned him up, said, I want to talk, and said that she had been abused as a young, I think tween, I think she was very young, 11 or 12, by a vague family acquaintance back home. And suddenly a lot fell into place. Like I'd put down, she'd had eating difficulties, and I'd noticed this. I'd said it to her once, and she denied it, and then she later said, yes, I did. I thought it was that classic thing, you can't control your schedule, you've been told what to do, and the one thing you can is control your eating. It's a bit of a cliche, but it seems to be one of the reasons for anorexia. But suddenly, all those things made a lot of sense. She obviously had difficulties when she broke up with her husband, Don, which are well documented. But what was nice talking to Ole was that she'd sort of come through that. And Noel talks about her having the same appetite, because they'd work off each other's ideas. And he couldn't keep up with her. She was sending him song ideas morning, noon, and night. And Noel's pretty fast, but he was like, Dolores, can you just slow down? She was reborn as an artist. She had a side project too with Ole and Andy Rourke from the Smiths. And that was interesting. I talked to Andy, who's in New York as well. And he said he saw the burgeoning love affair between Ole and Dolores and said it was a beautiful thing. Now, not only has Andy shared a studio with the Smiths, he shared a studio with Sinead O'Connor. And he said, in terms of natural artistic instinct, Dolores probably trumps the other two. He said, he'd be agonizing over something with Ole, in a song going, how do we make this better? She'd come in and go, I just do that. And he said, every single time it was right. She just heard it in her head. And so Andy, again, he was the big brother. He loved her. and he was fighting back the tears. He just loved her, and he loved the crack he had with her. So it was lovely to hear she had all these people that she was a Smiths nut. She absolutely, there's a song on one of their albums called Desperate Andy, which was like Morrissey by default. And I don't think Andy quite realised. He said they did have chats and she seemed to know a lot about the Smiths, but I said, you don't realise how much of a Smiths fan she was. So, you know, the fact she got to play in a band with this guy that she worshipped, you know, and that was at the end of her career, end of her life. There's something quite consoling about that, I think. And I was talking to Eileen O'Riordan, the mother. I can't stress, just a force of nature, like a daughter. You can see where she got it from. And Eileen talks about taking Dolores when she was a babby to church choir, and Dolores, before she could even speak, sort of humming along or singing along to the hymns. And, you know, the proudest day of Dolores's life, apart from her kids, was what she took one of them with her, was taking her mum to the Vatican to meet Il Papa, you know, going to see the Pope, because Eileen is a woman of very strong faith. And Eileen gets great solace from Miley Cyrus covering Zombie, from those 36 or so extremely talented Irish women in harmony who could have picked any song from the canon for that charity single last year to go and choose Dreams. And Eileen is grieving, of course, still, but she says, you know, in a way, Dolores is still around because the music is still around. That might sound corny, but I know what she means. Yeah.
Yeah, and it strikes me there's an extra sadness there, because actually you seem to be describing a woman who was in a really good place in her life, or seems to be, you know, finding new love, feeling creatively fulfilled, feeling on the cusp of newness again. So, you know, yeah, very sad, very tragic, really. Her passing, her Yesh Dega Rev Anam, and a beautiful tribute to her and to the band. Well done, Hot Press.
No, it was lovely to do. And it's funny, you know, final thing, I did what would have been her 50th birthday, a live stream with the lads from Limerick in September. And the first 5 minutes when you meet the lads, it's a bit sad because you're remembering and you're getting upset. But then you start laughing. And Noel will remember a story. And Ferg will remember the time that she did something wicked. And then you end up laughing. And, you know, with obviously her anniversary, I do feel sad. I feel quite emotional because
it was just last week.
Yeah, look, she wasn't my best friend, I have to say, but I checked in with her. You know, we shared quite a bit, and she'd always remember my family situation. She'd ask about my mum. She was always very loyal. When they weren't doing press, they'd talk to Hot Press. You know, we were the only magazine that got invited into her home, which was an enormous amount of trust to place. I liked her enormously. She was great fun, and it just is so sad. But what a body of work. And you know, as Codaline, her interviewed, who got to tour with the Cranberries, their first big gigs, Dreams will be sung in 40 years' time. It's not going anywhere.
Yeah. Stuart Clark, deputy editor of Hot Press, on the work and the life of Dolores O'Riordan and the amazing music they made as a band, the Cranberries. Great publication. Thank you for your chats. Really enjoyed
Final
it.
thing, can I just say, we're doing it the modern way. It's hotpress.com shop. We're doing it like that. We turn around in 24 hours. If you're straying up to Limerick, O'Mahony's, if you're in Dublin, Dubray.
Nice one, Stuart. Thank you, sir.
Cheers.